Across the wires and through the air, those who seek will find me there. Story, wonder, voice, and art, find the ears and find the heart. There are cities that feel planned, engineered, measured, paved over and pressed neatly into the landscape until nature becomes little more than decoration. Most American cities feel planted into the landscape. New Orleans feels like it was bargained with. You notice it almost immediately. The air itself feels different there. Heavy, wet, alive somehow. Step outside in the summer, and your skin instantly shines with humidity. Rain appears out of nowhere. Plants burst through the cracks in brick and concrete as if the earth is trying to reclaim the city, inch by inch. And underneath it all is water. Always water. The Mississippi River rolling dark beside the city. Swamps breathing at the edges. Rainstorms flooding streets in minutes. The constant awareness that much of the city sits below sea level, held together by pumps, levees, old engineering, and a collective stubbornness. And maybe that's why New Orleans can sometimes feel kind of haunted. Not because of all the ghost stories or the cemeteries, not because of vampires or voodoo queens or candlelit legends whispered to tourists in the French Quarter. No. I think New Orleans feels haunted because the city and the water remembers. Empire, floods, music, disease, colonization, celebration, death, survival. It remembers it all. And unlike many American cities, New Orleans never really hides those memories. They linger in the architecture, the food, the accents, in the music that drifts out of bars at 2 a.m, in the cemeteries that glow white beneath the moon, in the strange emotional landscape that settles over you here, like joy and grief somehow occupying the same body at the same time, and it feels good. And tonight, that's what I want to explore with you. We're not doing the top 10 haunted places version of New Orleans. Not the beads and bourbon caricature, but the deeper soul of the city. We're going to explore why this place feels so spiritually charged, and why folklore thrives there, and why in New Orleans, stories can live forever. Welcome, dear listener, to Wishcrafting. Tonight we are wandering into New Orleans, a city of spirits and stormwater and so much more. So grab a drink and let's take a walk. Most cities in America feel permanent. New Orleans does not. And I don't mean that negatively. In fact, I think it's part of the city's charm. New Orleans feels temporary in the way that a candle flame feels temporary, or a song or a thunderstorm, but specifically because it can't last forever. The city exists in a place that seems almost completely unsuitable for a city. New Orleans sits at the mouth of the Mississippi River, cradled between the river and Lake Pontchartrain, surrounded historically by swamps, marshlands, and wetlands. Most of it was quite literally built on soft delta mud, deposited over thousands of years by the river itself. The land here is shifting, sinking, and wet. And before levees and pumps and drainage canals, much of the area flooded constantly. Even now, the relationship between New Orleans and water is tense. The city survives because one of the most elaborate pumping systems in the world is built there. Giant machines work continuously to pull rainwater out of the bowl-shaped city. Levees hold back the Mississippi. Flood walls attempt to restrain Lake Pontchartrain and the Gulf beyond it. And yet, despite all of that engineering, water still feels incredibly close there. Sometimes uncomfortably close. And you can feel that in the summer storms. If you've never experienced a Gulf Coast thunderstorm, it's kind of difficult to explain the physicality of it. The sky doesn't just darken. It completely transforms. Clouds roll in thick, and they're bruised purple, black, and green. The air becomes electrically charged, and you can damn near taste it. The light is an uneasy green, and it drenches everything in a sense of uncomfortable anticipation. And then suddenly, rain falls so hard that it feels biblical. And this is warm rain. It's heavy rain. It's rain that turns streets into mirrors in minutes. And afterwards, steam rises from the pavement while the whole city smells like wet brick, river water, heady jasmine, and mildew, and fried food, and old wood. Which sounds like maybe it's kind of gross, but it's actually not. New Orleans is one of the few places that I've been where nature still feels like an active participant in daily life. It's not scenery there. It is not the background. It is a force. And human beings respond psychologically to places like that. It's called biophilia. From Britannia, quote, "Biophilia is the innate human tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life, often described as a love of life. Popularized by biologist Edward O. Wilson in 1984, the hypothesis suggests this affinity is rooted in our biology, influencing well-being and driving the desire to interact with natural systems." End quote. So, when we are in biophilic places, deep down, we know we are not fully in control there, and it lowers our inhibitions and the contractual obligations of everyday society. It allows us to tap into that part of us that wants to connect and to sink in and to become one and wild. Folklore thrives in landscapes like this, where certainty becomes fragile. Swamps create stories. Storms create stories. Floodplains create stories. Places where the environment can change suddenly, where visibility blurs and sounds carry strangely through fog and water, those places have always been home for ghosts, spirits, monsters, and gods. And New Orleans is filled with liminal geography. It exists between land and water, between river and ocean, between civilization and wilderness, and, maybe most importantly, between safety and disaster. You can feel that instability in the emotional atmosphere of the city itself. Kind of like everything there is just slightly dissolving around the edges. If New Orleans has a patron deity, it's probably the Mississippi River. The river is impossible to separate from the city's identity. It built New Orleans economically, culturally, spiritually, and geographically. Without the Mississippi River, there is no New Orleans. And for most of human history, rivers like this became sacred, whether people intended for them to or not. The Nile, the Ganges, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Civilizations form around rivers because rivers are life. But rivers are also dangerous as hell. They flood, they drown, they carry disease, and they reshape the land without ever asking permission. The Mississippi River is one of the most powerful rivers on Earth. It drains over 40% of the continental United States. Think about that for a moment. Rain falling in Montana, Ohio, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, the Dakotas, it all eventually finds its way downward through this enormous arterial system until it reaches Louisiana. So, this river carries the continent. Sitting beside this river, naturally, New Orleans became a crossroads, a threshold. How could it not? Goods, money, and people moved through it, and not always willingly. Enslaved Africans arrived through the port of New Orleans. French colonists, Spanish influence, Caribbean refugees, fleeing revolution in Haiti, as well as sailors, merchants, musicians, workers, con artists, mystics, runaways. The city became a cultural collision point because the river made it so. And port cities are always weird. There's a reason that folklore blooms in port cities across the world. They are places of transition. They usher in temporary identities, foreign languages, disappearing people, new diseases and religions and gods, among countless other things. All of these things, however, arrive with people. People arrive carrying stories. They leave them behind and they take new ones with them when they leave. And those same stories become altered by whatever they've encountered. That kind of constant exchange creates a cultural magic. It certainly did in New Orleans. It definitely created music. Jazz could only have emerged from a city like this. A city built from collision and improvisation. African rhythms blending with European instrumentation. Caribbean influence meeting Southern sorrow and ecstatic celebration. The music of New Orleans feels alive because the city is alive. It's not polished and it's not restrained, but it is alive. And maybe that's why so much folklore in New Orleans feels musical. The city doesn't just tell ghost stories, but it sings them. The first time you see the cemeteries in New Orleans, they almost don't look real, especially at dusk or under a full moon. Rows of white tombs glow softly in fading light, and small stone streets lined not with houses, but with the dead, abound. People often call them cities of the dead, and for me, that description feels accurate. These cemeteries don't feel hidden away from life whatsoever. They are neighborhoods unto themselves, and in many ways they are. Now, practically speaking, the reason New Orleans buries its dead above ground is simple. The water table is incredibly high. Historically, if you buried a coffin deeply in the wet soil, there was a very real chance that it would rise back up during flooding. The earth here is saturated. It is unstable, and it is constantly shifting with the water. So over time, tomb culture developed instead. Vaults, crypts, and family mausoleums, entire generations resting together above ground beneath carved stone and weather-worn angels. But emotionally, spiritually, this changed the city's relationship with death itself. In much of modern America, death is hidden and sanitized and pushed away. It's very, very removed from daily life and often as quickly as possible. But in New Orleans, the dead remain visible. You pass cemeteries casually. You walk beside tombs on your way to lunch. Funeral processions move through the streets with brass bands playing music that somehow sounds mournful and joyful at the same time. And that juxtaposition, that coexistence of grief and celebration, that is deeply New Orleans. New Orleans is the origin place of the jazz funeral. Though imitated and inspired in other places, the jazz funeral is a distinctly NOLA tradition. And there's something profoundly human about jazz funerals to me. The slow procession, the sorrowful opening hymns, the gradual transformation into rhythm and movement and dancing. It's not denying grief or pretending that death is beautiful, but it's a refusal to let mourning exist without life beside it. That emotional philosophy runs through the entire city. New Orleans understands something that many places try desperately to forget. That death is not the opposite of life. It is part of it. And because the dead remain physically present there, folklore naturally grows around them. Ghost stories flourish in New Orleans, not simply because people believe in spirits, but because the city maintains intimacy with the dead, with memory. In New Orleans, the dead are never fully gone. They remain neighbors. You see it in the offerings left at tombs, in candles burning beside photographs, in the reverence for the ancestors, in the way names and histories are repeated and preserved. And when a culture keeps the dead close, the boundary between worlds begins to feel thinner. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when talking about New Orleans is treating it like it emerged from a single culture. It didn't. New Orleans is layered. French influence shaped the architecture and early colonial identity. Then came Spanish rule, which transformed parts of the city after devastating fires destroyed much of old New Orleans in the late 1700s. African traditions arrived through the brutality of slavery. Haitian influence surged into the city after the Haitian Revolution sent waves of refugees into Louisiana. Caribbean spirituality mixed with Catholicism, and indigenous knowledge already existed in the indigenous people that lived there, within the land, on the land itself. And somehow over centuries, all of these worlds collided and blended into something entirely unique. That blending is part of why New Orleans feels spiritually different from much of the United States. Much of early America developed under rigid Anglo-Protestant structures that often distrusted ecstatic ritual, ancestor reverence, spirit work, and sensory spirituality. But New Orleans developed differently. Here, spirituality spilled into the streets. The visible and invisible worlds overlapped constantly. And importantly, and I'm going to drive this home now, much of this was not hidden. New Orleans has long possessed a kind of public spirituality. Not necessarily organized and definitely not orthodox, but deeply lived in. And you can still feel it when you walk through the city today. Little shrines tucked into corners, statues watching from courtyards, tarot readers basically everywhere, offerings left quietly at places that tourists walk past without noticing. And then, of course, there's the city's relationship with voodoo, which has been sensationalized almost beyond recognition in popular culture. Real Louisiana voodoo is not Hollywood's dolls and curses. Real Louisiana voodoo emerged from African diasporic spiritual traditions that blended with Catholicism and local folk practices. It became a survival system, a spiritual framework carried by enslaved people who preserved fragments of culture and sacred knowledge under horrific conditions. And figures like Marie Laveau became legendary because they occupied real positions of spiritual and social influence within the city. New Orleans remembers these layers. That's why it feels old in a way that many American cities don't. Like generations of belief still linger there in the walls themselves. There's a word that I use a lot on this podcast. Okay, a couple words. But what I'm talking about in this instance is liminal. It comes from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold. That's another word that I love to use on this podcast. A liminal place is somewhere in between, a crossing point, a boundary, and historically human beings have always believed that thresholds possess spiritual power. Doorways, crossroads, shorelines, riverbanks, twilight, graveyards, all places where one thing becomes another. New Orleans may be one of the most liminal cities in America. It exists between land and water, between North America and the Caribbean, between wealth and ruin, between celebration and grief, between devotion and vice, between the living and the dead. And liminal places, they generate stories, they generate magic, they generate folklore because they destabilize certainty. They create a type of psychological openness. When people enter spaces where normal rules feel weaker, the imagination expands. Stories emerge more easily. Spiritual experiences feel more plausible. Symbolism intensifies. That's why port cities become full of ghost stories. Why swamps become full of monsters. Why crossroads become places where people meet devils and spirits. Human beings instinctively mythologize unstable places. And New Orleans is beautifully unstable. A city constantly transforming itself. Buildings decay while music pours out of them. Floodwater comes and it goes. Entire neighborhoods carry layers of memory and trauma and celebration simultaneously. Even emotionally, New Orleans feels liminal. There is a melancholy here that's difficult to explain unless you've experienced it yourself. It's not a hopelessness, but it's something softer. Perhaps a bittersweetness. It's as though the city itself understands its impermanence and understands it deeply, and has decided to dance anyways. I think that emotional honesty is why so many people love this city. The city doesn't pretend that life is clean or fair. It acknowledges suffering, and acknowledges it often and openly. And then, it hands you a drink, starts the music back up, and tells you to keep living anyway. So maybe New Orleans both is and isn't haunted in the way that people usually mean. Maybe the city simply refuses to bury its memories. And when a place allows all of itself to coexist openly, it begins to feel spiritually charged. Not because something supernatural is constantly happening, but because the boundary between things feels thinner. In New Orleans, the past and the present don't feel very distant at all. Life and death are in cahoots. The line between sacred and ordinary are blurred. New Orleans is a city that reminds you that human beings are fragile creatures, living temporary lives in temporary bodies, building temporary homes beside an enormous river that could reclaim everything in the blink of an eye. And that reality permeates, and it makes the city incredibly unique and beautiful. My dear listener, New Orleans understands something ancient, that impermanence is not the enemy of beauty. It is the reason that beauty matters at all. Put thunder here, thunder sound here, and start some music up. Thank you for wandering with me tonight through cemeteries, cobbled alleys, and spirit-haunted streets. This is only the beginning of our journey through New Orleans. There are still ghosts waiting in the Garden District, storms gathering over the Gulf, and crossroads humming with old blues legends. I'm so happy to have you here. My name is Wishamaya. Don't forget to keep your roots deep and your dreams